All right, welcome again, everyone. You are here for Serving Incarcerated Survivors Beyond Basics. And as I said, go ahead and introduce yourselves in the chat. We ourselves are also going to introduce ourselves. As I mentioned, I'm Marcela Rojas. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm one of the project managers here at Valor and oversee the California Advancing PREA project and a few other projects as well. And I'm joined by my colleagues today. I'll have them introduce themselves too.
Hi, folks. Good morning. My name is Jenica Sinor. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm a project coordinator here at Valor US, primarily working on the California Advancing PREA project with these lovely folks. I'm glad to be here and looking forward to getting to chat about some Beyond Basics.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Yamila Cervantes. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a program officer with Just Detention International. I do some training and technical assistance, and I also do a lot of the direct service work at JDI as their program officer.
And
good morning, everybody. Oh, I'm sorry, not me.
No, I was going to introduce you, Omar. Go for it.
Okay, that's cool.
So Omar is one of our amazing detention advocates and coordinators, and he'll be presenting with us as well. So I'll hand it over to you, Omar.
Thank you, Marcella. Yes, so good morning. My name is Omar Johnson. I have been the detention advocacy coordinator with Stand Up Placer for the last 3.5 years. Recently, I'm working as the sexual assault services supervisor for all of our sexual assault programs, so SART, human trafficking, sexual assault, and detention advocacy. My pronouns are he, his, and him. And I just want to say thank you for having me, and I'm looking forward to a great training.
And so we'll go over some basics around Zoom. We've all been using Zoom for a little bit now, so this is just a review. Feel free to use the chat feature if you have any questions or if anything really resonates with you or you're super excited about it. We will be asking a couple questions for the chat box too, or kind of asking for some input on things. So please keep that in mind. If you have any issues logging in or hearing folks or being able to connect to audio, you can always call in on your phone. And that phone number is in like the registration link that you should have in your email if you need to. So Valor US, formerly known as the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, or CalCASA, is committed to preventing and ending sexual violence by advancing equity and eradicating oppression. We provide leadership, vision, and resources to rape crisis centers, individuals, and other entities committed to ending sexual violence. Ultimately, what we envision is a world free from violence where the dignity of every person is valued and respected. So we'll talk a little bit about the California Advancing PREA project. Now in its 7th year, the California Office of Emergency Services, or CalOES, has funded the California Advancing PREA project, and it allows Valor and JDI to partner in offering support and guidance to rape crisis centers in California on how to build strong relationships with CDCR, or the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, county jails, and juvenile facilities. We provide guidance on how to create sustainable agreements for the provision of victim services to survivors. Although a lot of progress has been made, we understand that there continues to be a huge gap and challenges in the services available to survivors behind bars.
And like I mentioned, I'm here on behalf of Just Detention International, which is a health and human rights organization that seeks to end sexual abuse in all forms of detention. Our core goals are to work with corrections officials, rape crisis centers, and policymakers to make detention facilities safer. We also hope to change public attitudes about sexual abuse behind bars. And then lastly, we want to ensure that survivors get the help that they need. Our core principle is that no matter what crime someone has committed, rape isn't part of the penalty. And it's really our fundamental belief that when the government takes away someone's freedom, it also takes on an absolute responsibility to protect that person's safety. So we want to outline a few of the session objectives. Today, we hope that this training helps you determine your agency's capacity to offer services beyond just letter writing and hotline calls and forensic accompaniment. We also hope that it helps you identify ways to advocate on behalf of incarcerated survivors. And then furthermore, we hope that we're able to help you understand the steps for providing one-on-one in-person support services, as well as group services for incarcerated survivors of sexual abuse. Before jumping in, we just want to provide some context around the rates of sexual abuse in detention. Many of you have already seen this graphic, but again, just according to an estimate by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, about 200,000 people are sexually abused in US prisons and jails each year. We just want to make a note that this figure represents the number of people, not incidents, which means that many of the survivors included in this figure have likely been abused more than once and not always by the same perpetrator. The data that we have available for perpetrators of abuse suggests that nearly equal rates of sexual abuse are perpetrated by staff as by other incarcerated people at adult facilities. And by staff, we're not just talking about uniformed corrections officers, but we're talking about anyone employed in the facility, including mental health workers, including teachers, kitchen staff, volunteers, and contractors at the facility. And just one brief note on language. Throughout the presentation, we're going to be using the term incarcerated survivor instead of victim, but we also want to be clear that we're not just talking about people who were assaulted in a confinement setting, but also people who are experiencing sexual abuse, who had experienced sexual abuse prior to their incarceration. These survivors have the right to rape crisis services, and so that's why we include them in the definition. So just very briefly, what does PREA require? PREA just provides a floor of basic common sense access to advocates and their services for incarcerated survivors of sexual abuse. So what does this mean, right? Facilities are required to establish an MOU with community service providers like your agency, who can provide confidential emotional support services related to sexual abuse. They are also required to provide a mailing address and a telephone number to rape crisis agencies, and they must make incarcerated people aware of the extent to which these communications will be treated as confidential. They must also make advocates available to survivors during forensic medical exams and investigatory interviews. There's actually nothing within the PREA standards that requires facilities to allow in-person follow-up counseling sessions, or that allows rape crisis agencies to offer in-person or virtual groups. Really what this means is that the ability of your agency to offer these services is just going to rest heavily on your ability to build trust, to communicate professionally, and to make a strong case for the benefit and the safety and security that these services are going to provide. Everyone here on this call knows the benefits and the positive impact that in-person services and services beyond just letter writing and hotline calls can have on a facility and on its staff and its population as a whole. And so, we just want to be able to communicate that. And we also want you to know that the benefit to the survivor makes this challenge worth pursuing.
Thanks so much, Yumila. So we're going to get into sort of assessing your readiness to get a sense of, do you have the capacity to do this work? Do you have the relationships built, the MOU that's really being respected by staff and folks at the facility? So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that you should already have in place before you even start planning for in-person services, whether that's one-on-ones or support groups. And really, like I think Yumila mentioned, the floor is the MOU and the services that you see up on this slide here. And that is forensic exam accompaniment, free, unmonitored, unrecorded, confidential phone calls. And those first three words are so important to be able to establish with the facility. I know some folks that are working with county jails or juvenile centers, and you're getting to that conversation of, are they unrecorded? Are they confidential? Are they unmonitored? All of those things are going to be necessary. And then confidential written correspondence. Folks that are working with your state prisons, this is something that's already written into all of your MOUs, but I know some folks are working on this with their county jails and juvenile centers. And then last but not least, making sure that your MOU includes confidential in-person services. And as Yumila mentioned, This isn't something that's required by the PREA standards, but it is something that we know as a field is really beneficial for survivors to have. And I know during the pandemic, this is something that almost never happened or happened, once the facility opened up. So we'll talk a little bit about near the end there, planning for any sort of hiccups if the facility does close, or if you hear that, cases are rising in your community. So I do want to ask a quick poll question before I say anything further, and that is, does your agency have an MOU in place with all of your local facilities? Some of you may have state prisons, some of you may have state prisons and county jails and juvenile centers. Most of you probably do have county jails, since there's one in every single county. So I'm seeing most people are saying yes. Some people are saying no, some but not all, or are unsure. If you're unsure, let me know. Are you working with the facility? Do you know who you can ask in your organization if there is an MOU set? And for those of you that are working on MOUs, feel free to reach out to any of us. We will share our email addresses. I will drop mine in the chat, but we're always here to support with MOU renewals or starting a new one entirely. So let me end that poll and share some results. Yeah, so it looks like about 64% of folks do have MOUs in place. 14% said no, they don't have an MOU, some but not all. And then a few of you said, I'm unsure. So that's totally fine, no matter where you're at. We're here to support you. We have experience with reviewing MOUs and have a really critical eye of how folks are writing in confidentiality into your MOUs. But of course, the MOU is not the only thing that's important for establishing relationships. It is the relationship itself that's really important. So once you've confirmed with your staff, if you do have a really solid MOU, and the next thing you really want to be able to do is take some time to look at your actual practices and how you've been building relationships with staff. We've really observed that without these practices in place, ambitions to increase services are really not likely to be agreed upon by the facility or to even prove sustainable for us as the service providers. So let's go over some of these things. First, you should be able to be maintaining contact with at least one or two staff at the facility who are really in a position to help you gain access to in-person services and to coordinate those services, and who understands your services, why they're important, and really can help message about them to both incarcerated folks and their correctional staff. This could be a mental health director, a captain, a warden, an associate warden, a PREA compliance manager, a PREA coordinator. And so you should have that sort of rapport and trust between your agency and the staff at the facility, while of course maintaining your professional role to be there for your clients and really maintaining an understanding of that power differential between staff and those who are held in their custody. I think oftentimes we need to be really clear about rapport is, and that is rapport is not, sort of allowing staff to undermine your confidence in the importance of your services or your feelings of safety in working with incarcerated survivors. I think oftentimes we'll hear inappropriate comments from staff or minimizing comments from staff, either about sexual violence or about our services. And we really want to be able to work with folks and educate folks into messaging our services in a really meaningful way that speaks true to what we do. And so really, you can notice this by whether someone appreciates your expertise in trauma and abuse and, has your input and utilizes your input and seeks out your input. So that's really our goal for folks, to be able to have a relationship that's built in that way. You should also have firsthand experience with the facility. At a minimum, you should have already taken a tour and invited newly hired advocates, if you have any, to integrate that into their onboarding process. And this practice really indicates your agency's ownership over the work and the program that you hold for survivors behind bars, and really demonstrates your professional reliability and your desire to understand the sort of unique layout and culture of the facility. Knowing the layout of the facility is going to be really helpful in terms of advocating for confidential spaces, which we'll talk about later on. And you should also have some good working knowledge of the PREA standards, in particular, those that speak to the rights of incarcerated survivors to hold and have access to confidential emotional support services. Again, regardless of whether the abuse occurred in custody or prior to being in custody. And also in particular, regardless of the status of the investigation and whether or not they want to report the abuse. If a staff person tells you, well, they never reported, so they can't receive services, that's actually not true. And that's something that you can certainly educate them on. And the PREA standards can help you with that too, and us. And finally, you'll want to make sure that your agency has, like, as I mentioned, a strong letter writing program and confidential hotline access. And also having intake forms that are appropriate for all survivors, and to really ensure that your staff are tracking also, but not just that, but also being inclusive of folks in detention. When we have our intake forms, but we're not including a section where folks can collect their inmate ID number and the name of the facility at which they're held, it makes it very difficult to follow up if we don't have that information. And so we want all of our staff to be able to know to ask those questions on the hotline, so that if you're passing on a client providing a referral, that you have the information for that advocate or coordinator to reach out. So if you do have confidence in these practices and that they're in place, it may be time to start assessing and having conversations with your staff and your team about expanding your agency's presence at the facility and starting to have conversations with staff at the facility as well. So I'm going to pass it over to Yamila to talk about some of the barriers to service provision. We don't want to sort of romanticize that in-person services are going to be easy or that they're going to solve all the problems. So Yamila is going to set this up for us.
Yeah, thanks, Marcela. That's so true. I think definitely we don't want to pretend that this is going to be easy. We hope that it will be, but we also want to talk about some of the challenges that may present themselves in this work and how to prepare for them. So just some things to prepare for are coming across staff who may be either unfamiliar or dismissive of your role and the services that you provide to survivors. So you just want to make sure that you're able to explain who you are and what you do, while also maintaining confidentiality. And we know this can be difficult, especially when sometimes you may be referred to as the PREA person, or it may be obvious that clients are being called out because they're seeking services related to PREA. So that violates their confidentiality, and that makes these services kind of difficult to administer and to provide. So that's something that you want to be prepared for. Something else is just to be prepared for how frequently clients are transferred. You always just want to make sure you check the CDCR website or your local facility's roster to make sure that your client is still at the facility before you show up. Once you're there, there's a ton of reasons that a client might not show up to a session. Perhaps their housing was changed. Maybe they were just unable to show up. Maybe they were added to a work program or staff isn't allowing them to see you. Just keeping this in mind is helpful. And trying to advocate to talk to your client directly is also just best practice. And then building rapport with a client is an important piece in building trust. This means that your client may take some time before they really start talking to you about the abuse that you're there to work with them on. If there was just like a massive fight that happened, they may need to process that, even though you plan to talk to them about, for example, their childhood abuse. It's important to be flexible. It's enough to just be a supportive presence for a survivor, even if they aren't directly talking about sexual abuse or that isn't the main topic of their conversation right off the bat. A lot of clients need multiple sessions to build trust. We see this in and outside of detention. It's just important to think about if you want to provide more sessions to clients who are incarcerated than you normally would to people who aren't. And then finally, if you're being denied access to see your client or to a facility, that itself presents a challenge. We know that some rape crisis centers are currently facing that challenge now. And if you're unable to see them after you stress the importance of these sessions, You want to make sure to communicate that to the clients that you're working with, either via the letter or the phone, if possible. And you want to make sure to express why you couldn't see them and when you plan to be back. If you come across any of these issues, we strongly encourage you to reach out to Valor or JDI for additional support. And then there's barriers to participation itself, right? It's already difficult for a lot of survivors to talk about the sexual abuse that they've experienced, but the very real fear of retaliation, of appearing weak, and of shame is compounded in a detention setting for survivors of sexual abuse. And ultimately, these factors contribute to a code of silence that you can feel in your one-on-ones and in group settings. Groups that allow survivors to process and heal from trauma behind bars are also incredibly rare. And it may be the first time that a survivor is experiencing this kind of group. So that just may take some time for the survivor to get used to. We also know that experiences with oppression and marginalization before and during their incarceration may lead to some distrust in both the facilitators and other participants in a group setting, which is also something that you want to consider as a facilitator. And also in talking about oppression and marginalization, that itself can be a barrier to participation. We know that people have different levels of reading comprehension and comprehension in general, which may pose a barrier to their participation. And then we also know that people who are incarcerated are working through years of isolation. And this is especially true post COVID lockdown. In these instances, participants might be worried about speaking openly in a group setting, and they actually may be more accustomed to social isolation than they would be if maybe they weren't incarcerated. So this might just require you to be more creative about the activities and discussions and that you have, and the alternative forms of participation that your group has in place that maybe do not always require verbally sharing one's experience. And then lastly, participants might also think that the group is going to get canceled or that the facilitators will stop showing up after a while. This is very common in programming in prison and in jails, which is why it's so important to show up to all the groups and just to let people know if the group is going to be canceled. You always just want to do your best to try to notify participants beforehand, whether that's in the previous session or in a letter, just to continue building that trust with participants. So now I'm going to pass it off to Jenica to talk a little bit about approaches to advocacy in detention.
So when we talk about approaches to advocacy in detention, we're really talking about how to advocate on behalf of your client and working with the facility to, affect a potential outcome, or, working with the facility on behalf of your client. Once you have that solid relationship with your facility, you have those contacts available. It's really important that, or once you've also developed those like strong, sustainable programs for forensic exam accompaniment, letter writing, and hotline services, your next step might be to look into providing support, in-person support services at the facility. So when we're providing advocacy on behalf of a client, it will most usually be in the form of talking to your contact. Usually that's the PREA compliance manager or the PCM, but it could also be the head of medical or mental health. This is where, having a really strong relationship with the facility comes into play. The better your relationship is with the different staff at facility, the more your opinion and your words will be heard. This may be being kind of strategic about who you talk to and about what issues, how often you go to your contacts about advocacy concerns, and more importantly, how you actually word your concerns. You'll always want to be able to communicate in a professional manner, even when you're appalled at how your client's being treated. I'm sure, anybody who's worked with incarcerated survivors or anybody who's worked in the sexual violence community as a whole can think of an instance where we've been really shocked at how something was handled. It's really important for us to be able to maintain our professional communication as we're talking with these contacts. Unfortunately, when we're working, in a system, it's really important to be prepared for, nothing to happen as a result of our efforts. Staying grounded in our efforts is really important. Systems like incarceration move really slowly and bit by bit. And even though those empowered at a facility level are, beholden to those empowered at an agency level. So you might be working with a PCM who really wants to take action, who really wants to do certain things, but they're even part of a larger system, right? And it's important to keep that in mind as well. It's always important to keep pushing for the level of care, dignity, and safety that all people are entitled to. And also important to avoid burning out because you feel you aren't making an impact that you're expecting to make. The ability to help even just one person on the road to healing is always crucial to keep in mind, and it justifies our efforts. In addition, documentation. It's really important to document any advocacy efforts so you have a record of who you spoke to, what you said, how many times it was brought up. Keeping this kind of documentation can be helpful in recognizing patterns of concern at a particular facility. And it may help you if your facility is getting an audit and you're able to speak with an auditor about these patterns of concern. There may be times where advocating to the facility staff is not enough and you feel that contacting an oversight body makes the most sense. So keep that documentation.
I think that you might have.
I did. I just realized that I skipped around quite a bit.
Might have been, yeah. So I think you might have skipped this one.
I apologize about that. So when we're talking about, advocacy and what it addresses, while we all strongly believe in empowering survivors to make their own actions and choices, speaking up on behalf of a survivor who has already tried several remedies and is still not being heard can be the place where we can provide real support. There are a lot of instances where we may be able to provide that advocacy. One of the most obvious times we may speak up on behalf of a client is where they feel their immediate safety is at risk. People, or perhaps they maybe tried to report the abuse several times and they're just not being heard. And now they know that they have to see their abuser in the near future and they're really worried about their safety. So you can contact the PCM or reach out to your contact and let them know, these are the safety concerns that are present. Another issue that we may be able to address is housing. If a survivor is letting you know that their housing is making them unsafe, that they need single cell status to continue to heal and not be triggered, or that they're in need of some sort of protective custody, these may be things that you can bring up to the facility. A lot of survivors that we work with contact advocates about issues that they've had reporting in the reporting process, the investigation, or the ways that they received care after the abuse. These are all things that could also be brought up to the PCM. When a survivor is facing retaliation for reporting or facing ongoing harassment, such as being consistently misgendered by staff, this is another time we can possibly be able to advocate on our client's behalf. Another option or another opportunity to advocate on our client's behalf or when medical needs are needing to be addressed. So a client may need follow-up STI testing following an assault, or maybe facing issues getting their regular medication. While we're not medical professionals, we may be able to be a secondary voice to their concerns, and it can be helpful to, or this can be another opportunity to advocate for folks. It's important to keep in mind that while we can list all of these ways that we can advocate for folks, getting that permission and getting that release of information and making sure that survivors, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in the next couple slides, making sure that survivors know exactly how you're hoping to advocate for someone and that they're on board with it is really important. I think as advocates oftentimes have this long list of ways that we can have tangible support for folks, and especially with incarcerated survivors, there's constantly kind of a picking and choosing of what to do and what to advocate for. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Office of Sexual Abuse and Detention Elimination Ombudsperson. The Office of Inspector General is responsible for overseeing what happens inside California state prisons and ensures the impartial resolution of sexual abuse complaints. The Ombudsperson has the authority to inspect all CDCR institutions and to interview all folks who are incarcerated there. The OIG investigates reports on the mishandlings of incidences of sexual abuse within correctional facilities and may be able to provide assistance such as a transfer to prisoners who have been victims of sexual abuse. For those who have never used the oversight agency before, they can be especially helpful if you've noticed very alarming rights violations of survivors. You can contact them on a survivor's behalf, and you can encourage your client to contact them as well. While incarcerated, a survivor can write confidentially to the ombudsperson at the address above and make sure to let the survivor know to mark the envelope legal mail. From there, the OIG will contact officials at the prison to determine if a report of the alleged abuse has been made and to determine the status of the investigation. It's really important to note that both the identity of the survivor and that of the perpetrator likely will become public once the OIG gets involved. We want to encourage you to share this information with survivors so that they can self-advocate anytime they feel their case isn't being handled properly, and so that you can use it as well if you feel like your client is unable to contact them directly, and that there's been like a pattern of concern that you want to bring to their attention. So sometimes we have to parse out what kind of advocacy we can really do on behalf of survivor. They may be asking you to contact the governor on their behalf, but what their main concern is really around their housing and remaining on single cell status. This is why it's so important for us to make sure that we have a really strong understanding of what the survivor hopes to gain as a result of our advocacy efforts. In this example, it may make the most sense for us to actually talk to the PCM about their concerns as long as we have the consent of the survivor. Obviously, they're going to have more control over the survivor's movement and housing than someone like the governor. When we are doing any kind of work on behalf of a survivor, again, we want to be really clear about what we're doing. We want to make sure that we're communicating to the survivor what we're going to say, to whom we're going to talk to, and what each possible outcome we can think of might be. We'll want to make sure that we're being honest and careful not to overpromise anything. This can be really hard as an advocate because we want to be able to provide hope and we want to be able to provide encouragement for folks, but overpromising to folks just leads to maybe a letdown in the future because we have little control of what might happen once we actually advocate on behalf of someone. It's really hard, especially for incarcerated survivors, because folks get excited. People often aren't advocated for and often aren't heard and often aren't really seen in incarceration settings. And so it can be really hard to not get excited about when you actually have someone listening to you and saying, yeah, I'll talk to someone on your behalf. So while our word often carries more weight for the facility staff than the word of those who are incarcerated, this doesn't guarantee that you're saying something will change anything for the better of the survivor. And it's just important to make sure that survivors know this. We always want to make sure that we're being truthful, making sure that if you said you would talk to the PCM that week, that you actually do so, and that we follow up with the survivor about how that conversation went. We'll want to discuss safety concerns, always weigh the pros and cons of advocacy with the survivor. While retaliation is not allowed, that doesn't mean that it's not a very real uncommon thing that many survivors behind bars face, especially when attention is brought to an issue inside of a facility. Always let your clients know that there may be unintended negative results as a result of your advocacy, and talk through potential safety plans to help if this happens. As always, when you're going to advocate on behalf of a survivor, make sure you get a release of information. You can send a release in a letter. You can also fill one out with that person at a forensic exam if necessary. And you can also fill one out with the client while they're on the phone with you. And so we're going to go over this advocacy scenario. So as we go through this, please type in, your answers about how you might respond to this situation. So a survivor that you work with was assaulted by a fellow prisoner at another facility about 4 years ago. They filed a report and the abuse was substantiated. You learn that the perpetrator was transferred to your client's current facility and is in a similar, or is in a really wow, words are hard, man. And they're sharing a housing unit. They're in the same area as the survivor and they feel really unsafe. They ask you to advocate on their behalf and provide you with a release of information to contact the PCM at the facility. How might you handle this situation? Think about how you would communicate with the survivor, the PREA compliance manager, and any other folks you might interact with. And then how would you document this?
So I think I'm actually going to copy and paste that entire scenario in there.
Sure.
That way folks can reread it if they need to. And then I'll drop the questions in the chat because I realized they're a little bit more detailed than what's on the slides. So folks are able to unmute themselves or drop some responses in the chat. But yeah, I think, want to hear from folks. What actions would you take to advocate for the survivor? And any sort of support that you could provide to them verbally as well. So again, how might you handle the situation? Think about how you would communicate with the survivor, the PREA coordinator, and others, and how you would document your advocacy.
Are you guys able to hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I just felt like it was easier for me to talk than to type it out. I'm a slow typer. So the first part, our agency for both state and county facilities, we know the appeal process. So if it's deemed as unsubstantiated or the peer report was deemed as unfounded, we have a way of knowing how they can appeal the process. So we would most likely send a letter out informing them that although it was deemed as unsubstantiated or unfounded does not mean that a sexual assault did not happen. We believe you. And then the process of appealing is completely up to you if you want to do this. And then we provide them with the steps on how to do that. As far as the perpetrator was transferred to your client, again, speaking to the PREA coordinator either via email or on the phone, informing them of like the fact that our survivor is scared and they need to be transferred to a different facility. Most of the time, the survivors don't want to be transferred. They want to stay within that facility because again, it's like, why should I be punished because this happened to me? So again, advocating to have the perpetrator transferred. We've had to do that before. And then we've actually created a safety plan for if it's not going to happen, then what we should do to help them maintain safety within that. As far as documenting, our agency has a form where we pretty much document every single thing that we do or say. We will make copies, we'll print out the letters, emails. We have an Excel sheet where we have all that information too, just in case our system crashes, but we have numerous ways of documenting this. So that's just a little bit of what we would do.
Thank you so much, Brianna. You touched on all of those questions, and I really want to emphasize how important it is to document every step of the way when you are providing that advocacy. Just so you have, again, sort of a pattern of how the staff that you're working with respond. What are some of the ways that you've advocated in the past that have worked, and what are some ways that haven't worked? And I think sometimes it is based on an individual basis. And then once you go up the chain of command, it may be really based on the culture of the facility. So when we're working with you all, we often will ask you questions to get a sense of what your relationship is like to help us get a better sense of how you can respond to these issues. But I think going through the appeals process is one of them, regardless of what your relationship does look like or not. So I'm curious to see if other folks might have done something different or anything that you might add. You are welcome to unmute yourselves. Thanks again, Brianna. The other thing I would add too is affirming the survivor and letting them know how re-traumatizing that it is to see someone who you were not expecting to see, who assaulted you or harassed you. Especially if the report, not especially, but in particular, when the report was substantiated and you have this expectation oftentimes when something's substantiated that it got taken care of, that the person was held accountable, that you won't have to see them again. And so don't forget that piece around emotional support as well, and being able to affirm them and let them know this shouldn't have happened, but that you're going to help them, feel safer and come up with that safety plan. I think what you mentioned, Brianna, around, we don't know if our advocacy efforts are going to be helpful or not. So we want to make sure that we have a safety plan in the meantime while we're advocating for them. And no worries, Brianna, whether it was substantiated or unsubstantiated, this was a great process to be able to respond to the issue. Yeah. Jenica or Yamila, I don't know if you both had anything else you wanted to add. Just wanted to open it up for you too if you have anything else.
Yeah, I just wanted to speak again on the emotional support component, even just commending them for raising the concern to an advocate or raising the concern in general. Oftentimes for folks that have been assaulted and maybe it's in their past or it's been something that they feel like they might be like over at this point, it can be really easy to kind of stuff those feelings down and just kind of like power through and struggle internally. And so for them to like raise their hand and be like, hey, this isn't cool, I don't feel safe, and advocating them on behalf of themselves is super important and really, really valuable.
Yeah, thank you for saying that too. And Kathleen, thank you so much for noticing this too. Mentioning there's a difference between how you might approach this with a county jail versus a prison. Yes, prisons are much larger. They might have different housing units. So in particular with the county jail, Kathleen's mentioning, it's likely that both parties will be transferred into a different unit as the prison process is more punitive. So yeah, and I think thinking through too how oftentimes our advocacy may result in punishment, whether it's purposeful or not, on our behalf and on the staff's behalf. As I think Brianna mentioned, of course, the survivor doesn't want to have to transfer if they've established relationships there and they've already started programming to have the survivor move. Can be really re-traumatizing once again, and also feels really unjust to have to change your essentially change your life because there was a mistake made and there was they transferred your abuser to the prison that you're located in. So certainly really important to get to know your facility's culture and how decisions are made, and the layout of the facility itself, to see if it would even make a difference to have someone changed to a different housing unit. So definitely do your research before this, ask questions, and get clarity on how this process can be done with your partners.
And I was just going to add, Marcela, I really appreciate you bringing this up, Kathleen, because I think it also just, for me, highlights the importance, again, of your role as an advocate, because you have different tools in your toolbox to address a particular challenge that a survivor is experiencing. Like, I'm thinking about how, even though we're talking specifically about advocacy in this case, you can plan, you can provide like a safety plan, you can work on a safety plan with a survivor. That's something that you have in your toolbox that you can use also to ensure that a survivor is safe, even when they are housed with their abuser. So working through those different pieces, and also using all those tools in your tool, using the hotline, using the letter writing, using safety planning, using the different coping skills that you have. And we'll talk about that in a second as well. That's all important in order to ensure the survivor's safety. Sometimes it isn't possible to, have people housed separately. And so again, having different options available for a survivor is always key.
Thanks for adding that, Yamila. So now that we've talked about advocacy and what it takes to provide meaningful advocacy and really transparent advocacy, we're going to talk about planning for individual in-person support in detention settings. So these are some of the points that you should hit when you're planning internally for individual in-person support. And a good place to start, once again, is determining your capacity for going to the facility and how often you'll be going. For some of you, it may be that you're going once a month. For others of you, maybe you have more time and can go in once a week. And make sure to ask about programming too, and when it makes the most sense for you to come in to see survivors when they actually have the time to meet with you. One idea some folks have utilized is to set up a regular recurring day and time that you'll be at the facility. I think routine is going to be really important for folks so that they know when to expect you there. If you've determined that you can only go once a month, for example, you would go every Tuesday at 11 a.m. for a certain amount of time. You also want to think through how long you want your sessions to be, whether you want to set a max for the sessions that you provide, or if you don't want to be setting a max for those sessions and having that conversation as well with your PREA coordinator. Sometimes they are going to expect you to have 10 sessions only because that's what their assumptions are around counseling. So really being able to advocate on behalf of your services if you know that you don't want to have a max set amount of sessions. And then you want to be thinking about counseling policies as well. Make sure that they're clear and are written up in a way so that your client has a strong understanding of your capacity before you begin services. I know that some agencies may have service agreements that sort of outline expectations that you have for your clients, and then also outline expectations that your clients can have of you around respectful communication and how you'll communicate with each other outside of seeing each other in person, so that you've established those boundaries and they know when they'll be able to reach out to you and how you'll be available if you're not able to go in person. Another thing to be upfront with is your agency's policies regarding advocacy and boundaries. Just as in the community, some people may reach out to you for reasons outside of their own healing. And I think in particular, when you're working with incarcerated folks are going to want to reach out for other services that they haven't been able to receive or other referrals that they haven't received before. And it's always best practice for you all to be able to be upfront about what is within the scope of your work and what's outside of the scope of your work. I know many of you are trying to build really reliable referral systems based on the questions and requests you've received from your clients. And you always want to vet them, give the agency a call, get a sense of whether they have experience working with incarcerated folks, whether they're going to respond to folks, and if they have a confidential way of communicating with people. What you don't want to have happen is that your client expects that all services are going to be confidential just because yours are. So you definitely want to provide that clarity with them. And then also a note in terms of if you are being threatened or harassed by clients, I know folks in the community have also had this experience, have a termination policy around this. This can be part of your service agreement. And have that already established from the beginning of establishing those sessions. And it can be really helpful to have those written and in place so that you can be able to go ahead and respond in a way that is trauma informed. We don't ever want to terminate services in a way that's going to re-traumatize them, whether that re-traumatizes a wound around their abuse or a wound around someone just simply not showing up for them in prison or in jail. I think most of us know that's something that happens quite often, and we don't want to add that other layer of isolation and lack of support, and want to be able to provide a meaningful reason for why we're terminating services. And then you'll also want to have a policy around cancellation and mediums of communication, and go ahead and revise those policies to include how you'll communicate with incarcerated survivors. And then last but not least, we also recognize that during the pandemic, the facilities have mostly remained closed to outside visitors. And so over time, facilities have opened and closed due to changes in COVID rates. So you'll want to make sure that you're paying attention to increases in COVID in your local facilities and in your community. Even if the prison or the jail or the juvenile center has not been shut down to visitors, you'll want to consider whether your entrance into the facility will have unwanted adverse effects on prisoners and staff. In an enclosed space like this, prisoners are not able to leave, obviously, at the end of the day. And so it makes folks a lot more vulnerable to spreading COVID-19. And so we want to be mindful of of course, providing services, but also not wanting to spread anything to folks that are in a vulnerable place. All right. And then, of course, you've thought about internal practices, and now we want to think about coordinating with the facility. You'll want to go ahead and find, in particular, a confidential space to meet with your clients if you're doing one-on-ones, really regardless of the security level of their housing. Since we know that, there are some housing units that are high security and others that are not. And many advocates will be able to meet in a place that a lawyer meets with their clients in. It might be a booth of some sort, an enclosed space. And others may use sort of a medical or mental health area, a classroom, or even some of the staff offices. And then next, you'll want to have a clear way that survivors can sign up for your in-person services. A good place to start is a self-referral through your hotline, a letter, or a forensic exam. If this is the case, you'll need to make sure to get the survivor's permission. And best practice would be to also get a release of information for you to see them in person and to work with the facility to set this up. And you can also create a referral process for those who disclose during the intake process. This is a question that gets asked during the intake process. And with mental health staff at the facility, that sometimes mental health staff will get disclosures. And it's always really a great practice to be able to train them on how to talk about your services and what's available right now, so that they're not just receiving the disclosure and unable to provide any sort of support or resources. And then you'll go ahead and want to develop a system with the facility on how survivors are able to actually meet with you within the facility. In some facilities, in particular California state prisons, they'll have to get permission from staff and a ducket, which is kind of like a hall pass for CDCR. And others may need to be escorted by security staff, in which case you'll really want to be mindful of confidentiality. And then another piece also of this is that your client may be in the SHU or in segregation, and you'll want to have a conversation with staff about whether you're able to go to them. Oftentimes they may say you're going to have to wait until they're out, but if not, go ahead and go in and get prepared to see them in a place that's not as friendly as a staff office or a classroom. So anything that you can bring to sort of soften that and bring in a little bit more warmth to that conversation, we want to do that. And then finally, it's always good to have a plan set in place in case of emergencies. Sometimes there may be a fight that breaks out and you may need to leave. As Jenica and I think Yamila also mentioned, sometimes a fight breaks out and then you won't be able to see your client at all. And so you definitely want to have a conversation with staff about how they're communicating those things to your client, so that they know that you didn't just not show up for them, but that you just weren't allowed to go in. And then, of course, a plan for folks that may be thinking about self-harm or harming others. Having a plan with mental health is going to be important for clients who are in imminent danger. Okay, I want to pause there and see if anybody has any questions, because we've said quite a bit here, and just want to see if anybody has any questions or any thoughts that they want to add for a second here. Okay, no questions, all good. We can also wait till the end. Or if you're still thinking of your question, feel free to drop that in the chat. So now we're going to talk about providing support services and really learning how to build rapport and communicate with your clients. So I'm actually going to pass it over to Omar to talk about providing support to your client and building rapport.
All right, thank you, Marcella. So when it comes to providing support to your client, obviously you can see the first bullet point here is building rapport. What I want everybody to do while we talk about this next content is to think about this as a theme of communication, right? And what does it take to be a supreme communicator? Think of it from that context, because in order to build rapport, you're going to have those type of skills. So the first thing I think about when it says build rapport, you think why? And I think how, like how do you do that? So in terms of the why I think is maybe not as obvious as it might seem, but the why is because in order to do all the things we're going to have to do to help our clients, we're going to need to have rapport. And building rapport is a direct connection to building trust. And in my opinion, that's the foundation of what we're going to have to do. So when I go into a session with clients, that's the first thing I'm trying to create. I don't really focus on too much else. I focus on how am I going to listen, how am I going to be an active listener and be a supreme communicator. So one of the first things we do here at Stand Up Placer, and since our name is Stand Up, when someone comes into the booth to speak to us for the first time and every time, we stand up and we show that respect. We let them see that they have value, that there's someone that's important to us. If no one else, they're important to me and to our advocates. And so we stand up when they walk in the room. You get a variety of reactions as well, but they definitely feel it. And so from the very beginning, we're starting to build that rapport. What type of qualities do you have to have? Number one, you have to be present. Earlier, Jenica said something that's very important. She said something about if you can just help just that one person. So in advocacy, every person you talk to is that one person, right? You have to be present there to listen. You have to come in with humility, which I think is probably the most important quality, because humility attaches so many other things to it. If you're humble, you're going to show respect. If you're humble, you're going to let this person see that they're important to you, and you're going to listen very actively. So not only do you have to have humility, you have to have empathy and compassion, of course, right? And so they also talk about sometimes people may be distrustful, and so you really have to come in with your own sense of authenticity, right? You can't try to be someone else. You have to be who you are. They sniff that type of stuff out really quickly. If you're trying to, be who your trainer was or someone else, you have to be yourself. So there's many ways to build the rapport in terms of who you are and being sincere, but you have to have the qualities I mentioned earlier: the humility, empathy, compassion, and those type of skills in terms of communication. When it comes to, I think when it comes to setting goals, one thing I do when I go into my sessions is really I allow them to set the tone. I might not set goals with a client for 2 or 3 sessions sometimes, because maybe what they need is just to listen, someone to listen to them. And I try to remind myself that, in terms of being an advocate, I'm not the champion, I'm a champion, right, for them. And so when I come into that room, it's all about them. When it comes to the point that we can set goals, if they're in that space, I let them determine the goals we set. And how we set those goals typically is by asking them what their needs are. We talk about that, right? And they share the needs, and I help them also in the same process. We're helping them build autonomy, because we're showing them how just in real life, these are some empowerment skills of, okay, how do you set goals and how do you achieve these goals, right? And so you start with the need and the issues that are going on, you talk about them, you validate those feelings, you validate that all that stuff is real, and you let them know how, unfortunate it is that it's happening to them, but we're gonna figure this out together. And so from those needs, you figure out, okay, what are the goals we're gonna set? And what I try to do also is I help my clients, I ask them for the next session, if you didn't the first time, bring in a pen and pad, because we're both gonna be taking notes on what needs to get done. And that's how we're gonna do it together, because we're not doing anything for them, right? We're doing it with them. And in order for us to be successful long-term, in terms of long-term advocacy, is to help them do these things for themselves. And so in terms of setting goals, what we do here, we call it an action plan. It can go by many names, right? But the idea is to set the goals for what needs to be done, set the time frames. When are they getting out? To be honest with you, sometimes I meet a client, if they're getting out within a week, I listen to them. I do all that in the beginning, and I say, hey, listen, I definitely want to connect with you. I want to find out about all the trauma that's going on, but you got some time constraints. Would you like to spend your time doing this? Do you think this would be something to do? I ask them, I let them decide that. But I put it out there because sometimes that is important. You might have to do the plan pretty quickly if someone's getting out in a day or two. And so in putting the plan together and figuring out what their needs are, then you come up to what are the things you can help them with, and what are the things that some of your partners or other referrals might be able to help them with. So it's very important, and also in building rapport, going back to what Jenica said, is to set the right tone and atmosphere for what they should expect from you, right? And what you are really there to do. In our situation, emotional support is our number one product, so to speak, right? And so, but many things build off of that. but the emotional support is what we're there to provide. So sometimes there's things that we can't do. I don't say to them, hey, we can't do that. I say, listen, I'm going to talk to you about what we can do specifically, and for the things that might not be what we're here to do, we're going to talk about other resources that do that better than us, that are partners we work with. We're going to, connect you with those partnerships. And sometimes they can do it while they're incarcerated. Sometimes they have to do it when they get out. We make all those determinations. But in terms of finding the appropriate referral source, there's a lot of ways to do that. For me, what happened was I just found out what people needed. I just kind of dove in, and then I go out and I do the research. And someone says, hey, I need housing or I need rehabilitation. When I leave the session, I go out and I find out what's out there. In some situations, I'll go visit the facility. I'll meet people. I'll get a sense for, the quality that someone might expect. Just being honest with you, as you guys know, in any occupation, there's levels of service that are great, and there's levels of service that are not so great. So also what I believe is important is to help the client manage that reality, right? To say, hey, based on what's out here, here's what's here, but here's how you can maximize that, because people have done it before you, and we've helped people do things in tough situations. So you might have to go out to that housing, the homeless shelter, and see what it's like. Take a tour, meet the staff there. You might want to go to the transitional homes and meet those people and see what it's like. For me, it was kind of cool because I got to go there with my clients, and that's kind of how I figured out, where some of the better referrals and more appropriate referrals for detention advocacy were. Same thing with probation officers. Another way is sometimes your clients will tell you, right? I'll have clients say, hey, this guy over here, at Prep out here in Placer County, man, he's awesome, man. I love going to his classes. I'm like, wow, who's this guy? Let me go meet him. Or, there's someone at Placer County that I work with, same thing. And so I go and try to connect with people that I can assist and that they can assist me. And that's basically it for that part. Yes, we can go to the next slide. Thank you. Normalizing trauma and what that means. When I think about normalizing trauma, essentially, to me, this is where the empathy and compassion comes in, right? And that when someone's speaking to you and telling you about what's happening with them, is that now you're using your great communication skills of body language, facial expressions, appropriate level of eye contact, right? To listen and let them know that, man, at some point you express to them, how sorry you are for it, how it happened to them. I often say, man, I'm sorry this happened to you, but I'm really glad you reached out to us because we can help you. That's something I do. So because sometimes people don't want you to feel sorry for them, but my own personal feelings that I'm going to express that, and they'll have to tell me if that's something they're uncomfortable with. But I express that, but I try to, smooth it out by letting them know that I'm glad you took the courageous action to call me and call us for us to come help you. Also, in terms of normalizing trauma, I believe they decide what we talk about. So I don't ever try to rush someone into doing an action plan if when I come into the session, what they want to do is just kind of vent or share their feelings. Sometimes that's exactly what a person needs. They need someone just to listen to them, and they're letting all this stuff out. It's a therapeutic process. It's not therapy, but it's definitely therapeutic. And sometimes I spit with some people, 2-3 sessions in a row where that's what we're doing. Especially when we have the time to do so. And so that also helps and goes back to building a rapport because they see that you're patient. They see that you care about them. And it's not about me and my agenda. It's about, what they're going through. And you normalize trauma as well. I have a saying that I feel and believe, which is, if not for the grace of God, there go I. And for me, what that means is that if I was in your situation and if I had the same circumstances and the same terrible things happen to me, I probably would have made the exact same decisions as you. And I love to convey that to my clients. So once again, back to building rapport and humility is showing them that, I'm here to help you. I'm not better than you. We have a different dynamic because I get to go home and you have to go back in here. But when I'm in here, you and I are together. And so that's another way you can validate people's feelings is show them sincerely that, I get why you did some of the things you did based on what happened to you, right? Now we have to find a way out of that or help you find a way to a more healthy life if you can. And then that comes into where coping skills come in. So in terms of coping skills, there's lots of, I guess you could say mental exercises that they're talking about here. But the first thing on the bullet point is journaling. Some people love to write, others don't. But in terms of journaling, in my opinion, it's a really great way to deal with what's happening with you. It doesn't have to just be necessarily, hey, here's what happened today. It could also be something that's, and I hope my clients realize this, it could be a foretelling. It could be, hey, here's how my day is gonna go. I get up in the morning and write, here's what I'm gonna do. Here's, I'm gonna maximize this day. I know my release date is whatever, 2 months in the future, a month in the future. Here's what I'm gonna do every day to get myself ready for that day. And I'm gonna focus on that. And so sometimes that's the way you can journal. Mindfulness and meditation. Something I also do for clients when we talk and I get to know them, I find out what their interests are. So mindfulness and meditation could be me, going back to my office and printing out something from the internet for them to read that has to do with that particular topic. But it could also have to do with other topics, right? It could be a topic like, somebody might want to know about how to be a better father. I brought that back to people, or what type of parenting skills they might want to develop. Or it might be something along the lines of, it could be a number of things. You guys can imagine what it could be. But the idea is that they're letting you know what's important to them. And so when you come back, you bring them that information for them to read. Other people, they like to do, in terms of mindfulness and meditation, is if you bring them back the information that explains how to do that, they can go back to their cells and do that. In my experience, some of the males haven't felt comfortable with that type of situation, but what you can do in that situation as well is, I have a lot of people that like to read the Bible, or they like to have Bible studies. And so I don't obviously, push religion, but I can have those discussions with people, in a more, in a human level, right? And sometimes that's what they need, right? And if they want me to, I'll bring back some scriptures from them from something I print out on the internet. In all honesty, I don't know a lot about progressive muscle relaxation. It sounds really cool. It sounds good. I don't know if you guys can read what's going on right there, but
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about it.
okay.
So it actually sounds, it's very much what it sounds like, progressive muscle relaxation. And you take some time starting with your feet to sort of release slowly. So you'll squeeze your muscles in your feet. I know it sounds really odd, like how do you squeeze the muscles in your feet? But you go ahead and squeeze them, maybe do them right now so you can practice if this is something you're interested in doing with your clients. And then you release it. And then you go all the way up your body slowly, but surely you'll get to the top of your head. And this is something that you can do without anybody really noticing that you're doing it. And it's something that we share with folks for that reason. You could literally be having lunch with someone and maybe you're getting triggered, not having lunch with someone, but in the lunch area. And you need to come back to your body. You need to come back to homeostasis. And this is an intervention that works for some folks. It may not work for others. And I think Omar mentioned this too, is being able to ask your clients what coping mechanisms they're already using is going to be really helpful. One, to help encourage them and remind them, to use them when certain things come up. And maybe you have a conversation about which coping mechanisms do you use when, you get triggered about a certain thing, or when an officer says something to you that was really disrespectful. What are some of those things that you do? And then reminding them that they have like a toolkit, a toolbox that they can bring up when those things come up when you're not there. So some people may like all three of these. Some folks may say, I don't want to journal. I don't want to process my feelings. It really just depends on where folks are at in their healing journey and what they feel safe to do within that system. Yeah. Omar, I don't know if you were wanting to add anything else or.
Yeah, I wanted to add a part about the follow-up. So in the connection to as you're building this relationship with your client and you're listening to them, you're showing them that you're trustworthy. You're doing all the things that Jenica and also Hamila were talking about earlier in terms of the processing to help them with advocacy, and you're working your plan when you come to meet with them. Then there's the follow-up, because the follow-up is important, because when people get out, as you may know, if you've done this a while, there's varied levels of connection at that point. So you could have built up the greatest rapport with people, and when they get out, sometimes they go back to the same things. Other people call you right away. What we try to do is have a plan to where on the day that they're being released, we've worked out with our advocates as to what we're going to do on that day, and sometimes even before that day. So in terms of follow-up, what we do is we actually bring them we have a really good relationship with Placer County Sheriff's Department here. So in some cases, they allow us a day before someone's getting out. We can, because when they get out, you never know if it's going to be, 6 a.m. or 6 p.m. So the day before, we can bring them like our care package. It's a backpack with a lot of people here have issues with homelessness. So there's all kind of little things in there to help them survive. There's our information. We've talked about whatever's going to happen if they go out and have to meet probation. We have other things we can follow up on. So the follow-up is very important. And I do want to end with one very important, just a story of a client that we've had that was one of the first detention clients that I met. And I think it's important to talk about the value of long-term advocacy. So here was a client in terms of bringing everything full circle. We met her when she was in a very serious mental health issue. She had a lot of issues going on there. But when I went in and met with her, I just listened. I dealt with a lot of crying that she was dealing with, and built a great rapport with her. One way to build rapport with her is what we did was there was a cat that she had that was very important, that was in a kind of a homeless area that she would stay in. And so that's what she put her emotions into worrying about this cat. And so she asked me if I would go and try to find the cat and feed the cat. I'm like, okay. At first I'm like, okay, I don't know if that's what we do, but I'm thinking that, but I'm like, okay, you know what? Yeah, okay. So we go do it. We find the space. Luckily I have cats. My wife loves cats. So we go and take some cat food. We put the cat food down. I take a picture of the whole area, say hello to some people, and then go back and show her, here's what we did, right? And I told her, I said, I don't know if the cat got the food, but it's something I did regularly because that was a way to build rapport. And we can happily say now through this whole journey, this was probably maybe 2019. She is now in our housing program. She's in her own place. She works with our sexual assault team, who helps her and takes her shopping sometimes and provides advocacy there. She works with our housing team, who got her into the place that she's in. And so it's a validation of what we do. That if we do as Jenica says, and think about just helping out one person, if you do that every time, that's the kind of outcomes are possible. And then you can tell other people, hey, look what she did, look what she went through and where she is, and other people that have succeeded as well. And that's just one of many stories I'm sure you guys have too. But it shows the power of building rapport. It shows the power of being an advocate, that you really care about people. And then it shows the power of those people and what they can do when they're helped properly. So I just want to end it with that and just say thank you.
Thanks so much, Omar. Yeah, and if folks haven't met with Omar or connected with Omar at any point, definitely connect with him. He's got some great insights around working with clients, particularly in county jails. I know that folks are in and out really quickly in county jails, so it can be really challenging to build rapport, but Omar's done a really great job of being able to provide long-term advocacy once folks are released, and be able to provide wraparound re-entry services and find some really awesome people to support his clients. So with that said, I'm curious to hear from you all what kind of coping mechanisms you've shared with survivors, what has worked, what hasn't worked. Feel free to unmute yourself or drop a message in the chat. Maybe you've used journaling like we've mentioned, or maybe you've been using the PMR handout. I know some folks have been using art therapy. So curious to hear from folks. What have you been offering your clients? Yeah, always love to hear from y'all, because we learn through you as well. And I know it's helpful for other advocates to hear from you all. So let us know if you have any. No coping mechanisms? You're like, we do journaling too, and we do art therapy, the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 method. Awesome. Yeah. So Brianna, do you want to say a little bit more about what that is?
Yeah, so generally, I mean, we'll have a handout for it, but I'm probably going to butcher the order because I don't have it in front of me, but it's like 5 things you see around you, like 4 things you hear. I'm probably butchering it, but it's kind of just getting them to divert their attention from whatever stress or anxiety they're going through. And then, you just keep going down, like 4 things that you can smell, 3 things that, I don't know, that whatever. So then 2 things you taste and something like that. So you go through that method and help, and a lot of them say that it is helpful because it does kind of take them out of that realm, and it kind of focuses them on like currently focusing on that. And so we do that also with our other survivors too, with they call the hotline and they're panicking. We just try to calm them down in that sense. I'm sorry, I don't know the methods by heart. I know if I have the piece of paper in front of me, I know it, but that's pretty much what we use.
It's all good. No, I think a lot of us are familiar with that method too.
Yeah.
And we can easily Google it too to get a sense of what that is too. I'm seeing Joanna say, I've realized meditation is only good for people who are on the more stable or patient side. Many of my clients get so frustrated trying to meditate, it becomes counterproductive. Yeah. With some of these things, I think we got to be mindful too that being in our bodies and being in rest mode is going to elicit a lot of thoughts and processing. And until we're really able to sit with those thoughts or let those thoughts kind of move through us, it can be really difficult to meditate. And so it could be that your client will be ready in a few months or a few years, but offering an alternative is always really helpful. And especially if they're feeling bad that they're not able to meditate, like there's something wrong or that they should be able to do this by now, really reassuring them and letting them know that healing is not a linear process and we can always find other ways of coping with things. Abby mentioned grounding all 4 corners of the feet and focusing on the sensations and weight of the body, which is, yeah, absolutely similar to PMR. And then Omar added, sometimes the connection we're able to provide on a human level is a type of coping mechanism. Absolutely. Being able to connect with someone who is affirming you, that is validating you, that is normalizing your trauma, connecting with someone, learning how to reconnect with someone after you've been betrayed by maybe somebody that you trust or people that said that they would take care of you. Yeah, Kathleen is mentioning it's a grounding technique. Guided meditation for no longer than 5 minutes can work. Also, yeah, absolutely affirmations. Maybe you write affirmations with your client or they take some time to write them and they come back to those and say those out loud or, say them in their minds. Abby's mentioned rubbing the palms together and feeling warmth is another technique I use. That's a good technique for folks that are also looking at computers a lot. Rub your fingers together and put them on your eyes. Yeah, thank you, Brianna. Dropped the activity in the chat. 5 things you see around you, 4 things you can touch around you, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and then 1 thing you can taste. And then Julia's mentioning self-care is something our agency pushes a lot on staff and something I always tell my clients to do as well. Yeah, I find that the better I am at self-care, the more ideas I have for people that need coping mechanisms or that are trying to figure out what they're going to include in their toolbox. So the bigger my toolbox, the bigger their toolbox. Yeah. Thank you all so much for sharing those. And I think a reminder, of course, these are things that we can use with ourselves too. If we're feeling triggered, if we're feeling burnt out, if we're feeling tired. All right, so we have another scenario that we want to go over with you all. And this is a little bit longer, so I'll also drop this in the chat so folks can go ahead and respond. So you're seeing your client for the second time. They initially contacted you on the hotline and let staff know about sexual harassment they have been experiencing, and you were able to set up an in-person meeting with them. During your first session, they didn't really talk about the sexual harassment, which is pretty common, but also seemed very nervous, and you were only able to meet with them for 20 minutes. In your second session, when you try to bring up the sexual harassment, they keep changing the subject and sharing about their medical concerns that they've been having. How might you want to shape your conversation with this client? And again, I want to normalize that it's quite often that our clients may not talk directly about the sexual harassment, and that is totally fine. There are other things that folks may have that they want to be able to talk about. And sometimes that just means that they have some immediate needs that need to get met before they can start processing or figuring out what outcome they want tied to that sexual harassment. So just want to normalize that's totally normal. And that, of course, folks that are incarcerated are going to have a lot of other issues that they may want to attend to. And sexual harassment and sexual abuse isn't always the first one. But when we're able to have those conversations with folks, it builds trust, right? Because we don't want to come in strong and just say, well, we can only talk about sexual violence, we can only talk about sexual abuse, because that really in some ways takes their power away, right? Because they're deciding what they want to share with you and being vulnerable with you. Joanna is saying, I validate and bring up the mind and body connection. Joanna, do you want to say a little bit more about the mind and body connection and how you talk about this with your clients?
Yes, but I'm working from home today and I think can you hear me? Do you hear the background noise?
No, we can only hear you.
Okay, perfect. So that's actually even with just like my regular clients, a lot of health concerns come up, and especially when we're doing like ongoing counseling sessions, I'll have clients bring up the fact that they feel sore, they feel tired, their body hurts after the sessions. And we'll, this is particularly true with like my like more recent immigrant clients, where they don't talk about mental health. They'll talk about like physical illnesses, but they won't talk about mental health, that they're connected and that they're equally important. And how then we'll kind of discuss like, okay, so like you're telling me about this, like where do you feel it when you talk to me about it? Where in your body are you experiencing that? And once they start noticing, they're kind of able to name it, like they'll be like, oh, I really feel it in my stomach. I think I'm scared, or I really feel it in my throat. I think I feel like silence, like they can't say what they need to say. And being able to bring it back, like, okay, kind of creating value for the emotional work, because it is linked, and they, after a while, they do start to notice like, oh, when I start working on this, this other stuff comes up, or like, I don't think I'm going to feel emotionally better until I feel physically well, right? Because sometimes it's one thing making the other thing bad and vice versa, or making the other thing hurt. Being able to really make that link to give value to both, obviously, your physical health, but your emotional well-being and state of mind, helps a lot of my clients prioritize self-care and like really lean into it.
Yeah, and I love that, because we're not, again, redirecting the conversation. It's still rooted in what they're wanting to talk about, but we're helping give shape to that physical pain and how it's tied to our emotions. Often I'll hear, people get a lot of headaches when they're getting stressed, when they're, let's say they're going through the investigation process and it doesn't go well. So how can we sort of paint a picture where people can name that emotion, because it can be really difficult to recover and heal when we don't know what it is, what kind of pain it is that we're feeling. And I mean emotional pain in particular. Yeah. Omar, I see you dropped a comment in the chat, says, one thing I do in introduction, I tell them that what we do and who our programs serve and how. That usually sets a tone where the trauma comes up in some way, at least in a topical way, because now they know who we are. Yeah. So being clear about what our expertise is in as well. Yeah. Kathleen is saying there's so many extra layers with an incarcerated client. They're not able to voice their emotions in their rooms as that can be perceived as weakness, become so used to keeping a lid on things. And there's also a trust factor, so that has to be addressed. Yeah, so I think we're also really speaking to like, there's no shame and blame in not being able to talk about it in the first and second sessions, and being able to acknowledge that that code of silence is also going to have an impact on how much and what your clients are sharing with you. Yeah, Julia, always want to be able to meet our clients where they're at and make sure to listen to what they're saying. Yeah. appreciate you all so much for having that compassion and that empathy and knowing like we're not always going to talk about the single issue that we see ourselves as experts in. And so sometimes we do some research on how do we talk about connecting the mind to the body. And I know there are some, certainly I'm sure there's some infographics that talk about how emotions are impacting certain parts of your body and what they're tied to. So it could always be a good handout to share with folks too. So we are going to take a 5-minute break. I know we got through an hour and a half without a break. So let's take 5 minutes. We'll come back at 11:31 Pacific time. If anybody's on the East Coast, it'll be 2:31. So we'll be back in a second here, and I'm going to stop the recording for now. Okay, welcome back, everyone. We're going to be talking about planning for in-person support group services now. So I'm going to hand it over to Jenica.
Thank you. So as we're talking about setting up group services in detention centers, there are certain considerations, not only when you're providing support in a group setting, but when you're in the planning stages. But first, we're going to kind of ground in listening to a video from a survivor, and I'll let Yamila talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so like in all the trainings we do, we want to keep the stories of survivors as a central part of the training. And in the video that we're going to watch, Tom Cahill shares some of his experiences as a survivor of sexual abuse and physical abuse. And just a little bit about Tom. Tom was and is a really important person in the JDI community. He served as a board member and also as the president of JDI from 1998 to 2006. And his efforts culminated in the passage of the Prison Rape Elimination Act. He also sat on JDI's Survivor Council, and he helped shape JDI.
My name is Tom Cahill.
For years.
I was 31 in 19.
And I'll let him actually share more about his story. We just wanted to honor his legacy just by sharing parts of his story here today. So sorry, Marcela, about that. You can go ahead and play it whenever.
No, my bad. I was not trying to play it early. I just wanted to get it ready for you. So let me get this to share screen and we'll play the video for everybody.
My name is Tom Cahill. I was 31 in 1968 when I was raped in jail.
Can you hear it?
I've been in a lot of therapy and I've done a lot of study on my own, trying to heal from the trauma. I used to have flashbacks where I'd pace a room just yelling and screaming in silence. Initially, what helped me heal was joining a women's rape support group in Napa, California. At first, the women, were a little leery of me, but as soon as I told my story, I felt accepted right away, especially by the facilitator, and I felt really good that we established rapport right away. And that helped a lot. Talking about it, that was helpful. In writing, I estimate I've written 100 articles, maybe a dozen and a half that were published, and that's always helped a lot. Trying to raise consciousness. This is a photo of President Bush and I shaking hands after he signed the PREA, the Prison Rape Elimination Act of 2003. I had been reading about these people, including Teddy Kennedy, and here I was rubbing shoulders with them. There's still that pain and outrage, but it's much diminished. The nightmares are long over. In a very important way, working to stop prisoner rape has helped me heal.
Thanks, Marcela, for playing that. Before I pass it off to Jenica, I just wanted to hear from folks. Was there anything that Tom said that maybe stood out to people or something that resonated with you? I know I saw Omar's mind working, I think. So I'm sure there's a lot of things that people have to share.
I was just surprised that I didn't. I don't think I knew his name before just now. So that was pretty amazing for me to see that. That was pretty cool to see. You know, when like a lot of times in this country, when somebody decides to stand up and do something, what can happen. So I think that's awesome. Glad to learn about that.
Yeah, thanks, Omar. And yeah, I feel like you're so right. Sometimes we don't honor people's names enough. We don't share their names out loud. So that's important to us for sure. Julia, yeah, that he attended a women's meeting, and something that stood out to me when he was talking about attending groups was the fact that he built rapport with the facilitators. Omar talked like extensively about how important that rapport was. And similarly, Rebecca, yeah, it shows the need for support groups for all people, not just women, definitely. And so I think something that stood out to me personally was that he mentions just how important it was building rapport with the facilitators and with other people in the group, right? It wasn't just the facilitator that was important, but feeling safe amongst the other participants as well. And so we hope that that also grounds us as we continue moving forward in this training, especially as we talk about the importance of in-person group services. So I'll pass it off to Jenica for that.
Thanks, Jamila. So yeah, thank you. When we're promoting our agency's ability to serve incarcerated survivors in support groups, we're also really advertising the value of all of our advocacy services to those survivors. So, you know, if you have a group that's running really well, a group where people feel heard, a group that's really impactful for folks, more and more you're going to build that, establish that you're a safe place and that your organization is a safe place for folks to go to. So it's really important to assess our agency's readiness to work with incarcerated survivors in a group setting prior to jumping in. So we're going to go over a couple different things to keep in mind. By no means is this an exhaustive list, but it's just some gentle guideposts. So if we've already been providing one-on-one in-person support services consistently with the support of at least one staff member from the facility, so you have that buy-in again from the facility itself, you have that contact that you're really close with, or that is, you know, an ally, so to speak, within the facility, you might be ready to start facilitating groups. Once you've established that rapport and that trust with one or two staff members, you can begin the process of advocating for the support groups. So this is before you're even starting the groups themselves. This is talking about having a curriculum ready to show facility staff that will help them really understand the goals of the groups and help improve the chances of receiving approval on facilitating those groups in general. The skills used when providing one-on-one support are similar to skills used when facilitating groups in general. However, it's important to consider the skills needed to facilitate conversations overall around coping mechanisms, the dynamics of sexual abuse in detention, and processing emotions in a diverse group setting. Advocates must feel confident in their ability to advocate, or I'm sorry, their ability to facilitate difficult conversations, set and hold boundaries, look out for triggers in a group setting, and adapt to the group's personality. So again, we really want to make sure that you and your agency feel that you have the capacity to offer groups sustainably and consistently. It's not often that survivors in detention have an opportunity to participate in a trauma-informed and non-judgmental group where they can learn about coping skills, process trauma, and be in a vulnerable community with each other. So you'll want to think about, how many sessions do you have the capacity to offer? You'll want to take into consideration that a 1-hour group can actually take several hours to prep, especially when you're thinking about travel time and physically getting in and out of the facility. You could be waiting around a little while. You could be, there could be lockdowns or the end of a lockdown as you're getting settled at the facility. There's a lot of things to think about when you're headed into the facility, and a lot of delays that could happen. Hopefully, you'll be able to have a co-facilitator that complements your skills and attributes. A co-facilitator can help you, monitor group dynamics while you facilitate the group, and vice versa. By having a co-facilitator, you guys will also be able to, monitor the group or help you problem solve if there's a group dynamic that's awkward or creating challenges. And it can also be really helpful to process and debrief the session once the group is ended. Holding groups and being, the only advocate in a space, hosting groups can be really, really hard and can feel overwhelming sometimes. So, having a co-facilitator that has some experience working with incarcerated survivors, has been cleared to enter the facility, and has taken a tour of the facility, and, complements your skills as a facilitator, can be really helpful. Another thing you'll want to think about is, how many people at a time can participate in the support group. Think about what's your maximum or your minimum for a group in the community, and how does that translate well to a detention setting that you're working in. In addition, how does that translate well in, COVID times? Is there a spacing that you have to keep in mind? Are there certain regulations that you have to keep in mind, or certain rules the facility has? How will you prepare if not enough people sign up for your groups? Will you meet with, your men's advisory council or your women's advisory council to help spread the word of mouth about the support groups? Will you wait to begin the group until you have a larger group of clients? In the future slides, we'll talk a little bit about how advertising can be part of inviting survivors to participate in your groups. But, you want to think about, in the case that there's like over enrollment, how will you prepare for future groups and creating a wait list?
Awesome. Thanks, Jenica, for talking about some of that internal planning. So per usual, we've got a plan with the facility as well. So as you do begin to do that, you'll want to think about, which facility staff is going to coordinate these groups with you, who's going to have the time to do that. And as you begin to coordinate with them, you want to think about obviously the location of the group, and figure out which units can have groups. You may want to ask whether the group will be accessible to people in different units. Sometimes it might be that, you might have a classroom in one unit and only people from that unit can join. So you'll really want to be thinking about that in particular when you're working with the larger state-run facilities, because they're going to have a lot more options, and obviously more housing units than a county jail does. And then when deciding the date and time of the group, you always want to consult with facility staff and potential participants, and avoid scheduling groups during any other programming and when meals are scheduled. You also want to think about if your agency can commit to providing groups in the evening or on the weekend, if that's a time that works best for the facility and for the participants. But you also want to be realistic about your own schedule as well at your agency. If it fits the facility structure but not your own, you'll want to, adapt to that as well. We don't want to stretch ourselves thin and promise something that we can't actually provide. And then as you begin to think about the topics and activities you're interested in offering, you'll want to ask what kind of materials that you're actually able to bring in for the group, and then which materials survivors can bring back once they're done with the group. If you're not able to bring in certain materials, you want to know that ahead of time so that you can either adapt the activity or change the activities that you're thinking about offering. I know I mentioned art therapy, so that might take, paint or, colored pencils or crayons and papers and things like that. Traditionally, those things are allowed, but you obviously want to make sure, if they are or not within your own facility. And then finally, if you will need to determine who will, you're going to want to determine who is going to approve the support group. We really recommend that you work from a structure and have a plan that includes descriptions of group topics, an array of activities that you'll be providing, and then handouts that you can share with the facility staff. They really want to know what you're doing within the group. And I find that the more that you share upfront, the more trusting they are of the group. And the more likely, crossing our fingers, that they'll make sure that the group is confidential, and that no staff will be within that classroom, right? And so most likely you'll be working with your PREA coordinator, but he or she or they may need to communicate up the chain of command. And so you want to give yourself a good amount of time to get that approval, so that you're not, planning for a group to start in a month, but you don't have approval yet. And then you'll also want to be thinking about certain restrictions or participation based on a person's classification. We'll want to be thinking about, once again, I mentioned already, confidentiality and whether staff will be present there. In the case that they can't allow the group to be confidential, what kind of activities are you going to be providing? Sometimes going back to art therapy, that can be a place where people don't have to talk as much. You can provide them with a prompt, and they don't need to necessarily write about the abuse, but they can draw or they can create art. So if you don't get that confidentiality approved, you can sort of adapt that so that there isn't a lot of processing within the group, and it's more so art-based, and folks can still process, but they don't need to be verbal about it. And then you want to obviously know ahead of time, or let folks ahead of time know to what extent that group is confidential, so that they can make a good decision about whether they want to participate. Yeah, okay. So last but not least, you'll want to ask how survivors will travel to and from the group. Will participants need ducats? As I mentioned, those are kind of like hall passes for CDCR. And this will need to be coordinated with your point person at your facility to, again, ensure confidentiality. So I just received a question too from a participant. How do you prioritize the facilitator's safety without facility staff present? And I'm pretty sure someone else is going to talk about this later on, but I think it's really around the screening process. Traditionally, I know in my experience when I was doing support groups or I was doing one-on-ones, what we would do is we would have counseling sessions, one-on-ones with folks first before we would invite folks to do support groups, especially when support groups tend to be more processy. You're communicating with other people. And so you really want to know who's going to be in that group. Who are you inviting into that space? You want to know, who, if someone's dating, if someone's a friend, or maybe they're enemies, these are folks that live with each other. And so we want to be mindful of the group dynamics within that group. So screening is going to be really important first, kind of getting to know the person first and wanting to know, maybe you ask a question around what is it that you want to work on within the group. And really not, I don't think we want to signal to the facility, right, that we're going to feel unsafe as facilitators. That isn't the main priority of the screening process. It really is to get to know the person. But in that process, you get to know someone's demeanor, how they respond to services, and how they work with someone who's providing advocacy or emotional support to them. So I hope that's helpful, Abby. I think we're going to talk a little bit more about the screening process later on. But I do want to get to the inclusive marketing. I won't get too much into this because we do have a handout that helps with getting a sense of how to create outreach materials. But as you mentioned, Tom joined a women's support group, and this was, I think he mentioned this was in the 70s, right? And so I think this was at a time when the field wasn't really thinking about gender inclusivity as much as we are now. So we want to be thinking about the colors, the language, the images that we're including on the support group handout, create advertisements for your group, including information on how to join. And then of course, speak with members of the Women's Advisory Council or the Men's Advisory Council to get a sense of, would you come to this if you saw this hanging up? Do you have a sense of what this is actually about? Is it clear? Are we sending a clear message about how you can join the group? So having other people vet your outreach materials, so you're not bringing in something that people aren't actually going to want to join or don't understand the purpose of it. So I think we're actually going to, I don't know, Jenica, did you want to go over this slide or did you want to go to the next one?
Yeah, we'll do this real quick.
Okay.
We are running a little bit low on time, so I am gonna go a little bit quicker in some of these next slides. So identifying the purpose of your group, what are you trying to accomplish with your group? What are you trying to provide for your group or with your group? Are you hoping to talk to people about establishing safety and identifying trauma responses or self-care and safety planning tips? Are you hoping to provide, a trauma processing and support group? Or maybe, the community you're working with could really benefit from reconnection and integration. Okay, next slide. And so the different types of groups that we'll talk about are psychoeducational groups. So that's exactly what it sounds like. Are educational groups that provide the foundation about abuse, around coping mechanisms, understanding power and control. Are you looking at a process-oriented group, which is, really focuses on storytelling and sharing of commonalities of what they've experienced? With process-oriented groups, it's important to have structure in that. So if there are time limits or group agreements that are saying, one person can speak at a time, process-oriented groups can really morph into its own thing if you don't have some structure involved with that. Healing arts groups, it can include creation of art or any kind of creative outlet. This can be a little bit trickier in incarcerated settings, but it's possible. Every facility has a list of approved materials, and if you can work within those materials lists, it's possible to do a healing arts groups. And these can be helpful because people can express themselves where they're at without having to divulge their story or divulge their trauma or what's going on. And then prevention groups are, again, exactly what it sounds like. Those are conversations and activities related to understanding consent and boundary setting, power and control, and then, bystander intervention. It can introduce the idea that sexual assault is preventable, not inevitable, because oftentimes growing up, many of us have learned that sexual violence is only preventable if the victim or the survivor has changed their behavior and actions, right? This can be a really powerful group for folks, but it's really important if we are having, or when we're having survivors participate in these types of groups, that they're maybe further along in their recovery process. So that's, where that screening process comes in and kind of understanding where survivors are at. And then again, more, internal planning, things to consider, what kind of group you're going to facilitate, the needs of the community, whether your group is going to be open or closed, how will folks sign up for your group? Are you working with the Women's Council or the Men's Council to promote the group? Are you working with a programs person to have folks sign up that way? Sometimes facilities will want to provide you a list of approved folks or provide you a list of folks and just say, okay, we're going to start this group and it starts on Tuesday. But making sure to advocate for a little bit of that screening process, or maybe that one-on-one prior to them being in that group, can be really important, not only to see if there are relationships within the group or things to consider, but also to make sure that someone is in a space where they can support, but can participate in a group and can be in a group setting like that. Let's see. Yeah, how members are going to be screen oriented. The other thing is, folks that when you have facility staff that are wanting to, provide you a list or saying like, oh, this person wouldn't do well in a group, or oh, this person would do well in a group. Obviously, if there are safety considerations, you'll, connect with the facility and talk about that. But there are also, staff at facilities have their own biases and have different motives for why they're working in the facility or what that looks like. And so having that screening process or having, your own process to see if a person can participate in a group is really important. And so the next slide originally we're going to talk about what happens once you've set up a group.
Yeah, I'm going to go through this briefly. So I just strongly encourage you all to reach out to us if you have any questions. But essentially, when facilitating groups, we just ask, want to kind of remind y'all to be flexible, have a structure, and have multiple ways for people to participate. We also encourage people to use group agreements. And I'm going to not talk about that because we have a form that you can actually use to adapt some group agreements for your group. And then we also encourage you all to prioritize evaluations. And we recently had an office hours on assessment and evaluations that you can also look through so that you can receive productive feedback from your support groups. So Marcela will drop that in the chat.
Yeah, so we have the group agreement form here, and then I will go ahead and share the office hours on assessment and evaluation in the chat. So we have lots of resources on our website.
Yes.
And I don't know, actually, Yamila, if you wanted to go ahead and talk a little bit about virtual services, since this is something that's been kind of new to the field.
Yeah, definitely. So just with the very real threat of the pandemic, right, it's important to keep both ourselves and participants safe. And often when people have found it difficult to find confidential spaces in person, they turn to virtual services. In order to do that, it's important to leverage technology that's already being used. Some people already have, some facilities already have virtual platforms that they use. And so it's just important to be well informed about the degree of confidentiality of that platform so we can share that with the participants. And then obviously you want to have all the different kinds of services established before you do in-person services and virtual services. But one thing that you can really rely on is phone appointments. So you would maybe reach out to a mental health staff member so that they can help you set that up at the facility. Or you can also consider developing short videos as an alternative to having an in-person group program. So that was very brief. Like I said, I really encourage you all to reach out to us if you are thinking about starting groups. And we wanted to sort of just open it up for questions that people may have. I know that section was a little bit rushed, but this is really the opportunity to ask questions about both groups and one-on-one services.
And as folks are thinking about questions, I'm just going to remind people of our resources. We do have our own website, valor.us, and Just Detention International's website, as well as the PREA Resource Center, which our two websites are really focused on advocacy, whereas the PREA Resource Center is really focused on PREA and supporting correctional officers, but I think it's really helpful for us to look at them too. And so here is JDI's specific website and link to their resources on working with incarcerated survivors. So I will go back to the question slide though, in case anybody has any questions.
And I was just I know we just flooded the chat with links, but one quick plug for our group guide. So I know we went over the tips very briefly, but this guide actually has a more comprehensive list of tips and of resources that we can access when we're thinking about having in-person groups.
Awesome. That's going to be super helpful. I know folks were looking for curriculums and a guide around creating groups. Yeah. So any questions, folks? I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Yeah, thank you all for joining us. Yeah, and just a reminder, you all can always reach out to us. If you send me or Jenica or Yamila an email, you really do probably hear back from all of us in some sorts. Dropping that email address in the chat again, and really hope to hear from you all. We do provide one-on-one intensive support and would love to connect with you all. Have a
Thank
lovely
you,
rest of your day.
everyone.